Okay, well, I believe the live stream link is working now, so hopefully everybody can see me that's online. I can't see you, but there's a chat feature on the right side of the screen where if you want to ask a question or anything, you can send that in, and I'll keep an eye on that as we're going. So, hi everyone, welcome. I'm glad to be back in here. It's going to be good. So, let me pray for us, and then we'll jump right in. Lord, we love you. Thank you for your goodness and your grace. And thank you for the chance to be here and study your word. Thank you for the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. Thank you for the picture of how the church started. And I pray that you will just guide us through this time and that we will become more committed followers of you as a result. We love you and praise things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so everybody got a syllabus. And if you're online on the Google Classroom page, this is the top of the page is this material here. You'll see under classwork, class materials, you'll see the syllabus there. So what we're going to do today is we're really hopefully just going to kind of set up what this class is all about and kind of walk you through how we're going to approach this semester. So let me situate this class in the larger kind of what the Institute's all about. So, in the Institute here, our goal is to develop kind of more advanced training in Bible and theology and ministry. And so we have multiple different tracks that you can be a part of. So we'll have a church planter track, a global outreach track. We'll have a fellowship staff track that is specifically for people who are on staff here, if there's some fellowship specific stuff we want to do. And then we'll have we're calling it the released leader track, and that's for anyone who wants to jump in. And so the core of that, 80% of that looks the same no matter what track you're in. It's core Bible and theology. And then the 20% extra is specialized training in your ministry focus. And so the core, that 80% core that's going to look the same for everybody, is two basic subjects, Bible and theology. The way one person describes that is you get Bible and you get beliefs. So we want to be able to work through the books of the Bible and really have a grasp of the scriptures. And then we want to work through basic Christian beliefs and try to understand how do we summarize what the Bible says. And one way to distinguish between the two kinds of classes, Bible is focusing on what the Bible says, and theology is focusing on what we can say about the Bible. Okay? Theology are the way questions typically actually come to us in ministry. Most of the questions you're gonna get are not, hey, can you explain to me what Paul is saying in Romans 9? You'll get that question occasionally, but the majority of the questions you're gonna get are gonna be, how am I saved? What should a church look like? Do I need to go to one church, or can I attend different churches and just kind of go? Those are the kinds of questions you're most going to get. Those are theological questions. So this class is one of our Bible classes. We're going to have our first systematic theology class this summer, and it's going to be working through the first portion of systematic theology. We'll talk more about that as we go. So grab your syllabus. I want to walk through a little bit of what this class is after. So this class is working through the book of Acts and Paul's letters. And we're really working on trying to interpret the issues of that through structure and background. And so we're going to look at the structure of the letters, and then we're going to look at some of the historical background that helps us understand them. Because this is an English-only class, meaning we don't expect anyone here knows Greek. We will point out important Greek things as they come along. We're not expecting anybody here to be doing original language stuff. If that is something you have a skill in or want to grow in, please let us know. We'll try to help you get as equipped in that and be able to work with that. But that's not something we're going to be expecting you to do here. So you can see the course schedule there. The dates on the side on that chart there are dates for the general week. And so the Fayetteville class is meeting once a week. They're meeting on Wednesdays. We're meeting twice a week. And so we're basically going to have twice as much time on each of those topics to be able to kind of slow down and go through them. And so you can kind of see where we're going to be and the reading that's recommended for each week. This is our textbook. It's Bruce Longenecker and Todd Still's Thinking Through Paul. So far, I had only gotten to just kind of glance at it before I chose it for the class, and so far I've really enjoyed working through it. I've found them to be really clear writers and do a really helpful survey of Paul's letters. So get a hold of this and just start working through that. I don't think the reading pace should be too intense. So we want to basically read through every book that we're going to be talking about, and then the companion part of Thinking Through Paul. Does So that's going to be our reading for the class. Any questions so far on that? Okay. As far as the assignments that we're doing, they're going to look remarkably similar to the assignments we've had in our, if you haven't caught on, we have a pattern for these Bible classes of what we want you to do. We want to outline one book, okay? And I'm going to let you pick the book. So pick a book that we're studying and do a synthetic outline of it. Everyone here's seen how to do that so far, but if you have questions, please continue to ask. We'll continue to post the resources on how to do that. So pick a book and outline it. And then our definition paper this time is going to be on the concept of justification. So we want to write a 2-page definition of justification. What does that mean? What does Paul have in mind when he talks about justification? And the final one, I think I might actually change. Garland has an argument paper here. Let's see how he defines that. I'm going to do something different than the argument paper for us. I'm going to have us do another exposition paper. And so an exposition paper is the prep work like you were going to teach a lesson on a passage. And so we're going to just pick a passage that you're interested in, and y'all seen how to do it. We'll go over how to do that later. But those are going to be your 3 assignments. And then to refresh our memory on what the function of those assignments are and how they work, essentially, we are setting up an institute here with kind of a certificate type process where we can say somebody completed this work. And the main reason we're wanting to do that is specifically so if you want to go work for another organization, a missions organization, a sending organization, many of them require a certain amount of Bible and theology. And we are trying to tailor this so we can meet their requirements. However, for us to do that with integrity, we have to actually say you did something, okay? And so the assignments are our measures of completion, okay? So you are welcome to attend, listen, learn, and not do any assignments. But we keep record of who does the assignments. And so then when you go, if you go and say you're being sent by Pioneers and they call and validate and say, hey, did Danny go through y'all's institute? I'm going to go back and look through what all was accomplished so I can tell them with integrity, yeah, this is what Danny completed, this is what he worked through. So that's the purpose of the assignments. It's the validation. It also gives us a chance to interact. I'm a strong believer that learning requires feedback. And so auditing is great for soaking up information, but real learning happens when you have to do something with it. And then you have to get some feedback on that. And so I really encourage you, you will get the most out of it if you do these assignments. I really sincerely believe that. So any questions over the syllabus, how we're going to go over it, how those assignments work? Okay, awesome. Hey, let's do this. I want to try to just set us up a little bit for where we are in this class. How many pages long is this thing? It's pretty good long. Oh, I think I gave you double. I think it's not as long as I thought it was. All right, so for those of you watching online, the 2 documents that you're going to want to open up from the Google Classroom page today are the Paul intro document, and I believe it's called, let's see what it's called on there. Yes, the Panorama Plus one. What I label that thing? I label it Panorama Plus. Acts Notes, yeah. Open the we're going to want the Acts Notes document and the Paul intro document. Okay, so when we think about interpreting the Bible, we talked about this in our Torah class. For those of you who are with us for the Torah class in the fall, we use a method that we call grammatical, historical, literary, theological. Okay, so walk me through what do we mean by that? What do we mean by grammatical when we talk about using a grammatical interpretation method? Do what? I'm sorry?
How it's written.
Yeah, how it's written, specifically how we want to pay attention to original meaning of words and how those words fit together. That might seem kind of obvious. It's remarkable how much interpretation skips over basic grammar. Okay, we're going to look at one example in Philippians that I think is just really fascinating, where people have spent a whole lot of time on this, this phrase, Jesus poured himself out. And they've tried to figure out, what did Jesus pour out? Did he pour out his divine power? Did he pour out his divine knowledge? Well, what is it that Jesus poured out? Well, the interesting thing is the grammar actually gives an object for the verb poured. You know what the object is? Himself. The sentence is not talking about any attribute that Jesus gave up. It's actually his whole self that he gave up. And that's very different, isn't it? And so some simple, like, actually paying attention, subject, verb, object. Really, like, cluing in what actually, I mean, like, literally dissertations are written on that verse that appear to me to skip over the basic grammar of the sentence that's really, really pretty clear on what it is Jesus gave up. It's actually right there. So we want to pay attention to those details. Now, most of us in here don't have Greek. So what do we do in light of that? This is where different Bible translations are going to help you out a lot. Some of your more, we're going to use the term literal, the kind of technical term. We're going to talk about dynamic equivalence, and then we're going to talk about a functional equivalence or a direct equivalence. What that means is, does each word in the original language get represented with a word in the new language? Now, for those of you who study at all in translation and linguistics, word for word translation is usually a really terrible idea. Like, it usually is nonsense. Okay, nobody translates that way in real life because it misrepresents the language, right? So I could use the example. It's really strong when you talk about phrases. So, for example, if I was translating the English idiom "shooting the breeze," okay, do y'all know what that phrase means?
Catching up.
You're just catching up. Okay, so if I went and I was translating into another language and I wanted to find a word that represents the verb to shoot, okay, I would find a verb that says to fire a weapon. And then I would look up for the word breeze, wind, and so I would translate, what were they doing? They were firing weapons into the wind. And that would be a very odd way to translate that. Okay, so that's a really silly example, but that's really common. Where word-for-word translations are helpful are when you're trying to get a sense of the grammar. And so I read an NIV for my morning devos. I mean, that's what I read day to day because I think it is a fantastic translation. It's what most people in the church are reading, and it's really helpful. It is helpful to have a more word-for-word type translation for when you're interested in the grammar. Something like the New American Standard, the ESV, the NRSV, those are going to represent, you're going to more clearly see subject, verb, object that represents the Greek. And so that's where they're helpful to have if you don't have Greek, to be able to look at a translation like that. So I like to have both line up side by side. What I've found when I'm doing original language work is when I am confused about the grammar in the Hebrew or Greek, and I can't quite figure out what's happening here, I'll compare it to a word-for-word translation, and that'll help me see, oh, this word is functioning as an indirect object. I see the grammar better. And yet, when I translate it myself, it never comes out reading like a New American Standard. I always translate it to sound more like an NIV, because I think that's just probably better translation practices. So all that to say, that was a little bit of a rant to say, I think it's valuable to have on hand an English Bible with a more literal bent, or I don't like the term literal, a more one-to-one, word-for-word bent for doing grammar stuff. So we'll talk more about how to do that grammatical analysis as we go. Talk to me about historical. What kinds of things are we concerned about when we talk about historical interpretation?
Would that be like the culture of the time?
Yes, absolutely. That's what's going on historically at the time that informs what's happening. And this is a really interesting issue to wrestle through, is what history is particularly relevant for the passage. So this is a discussion that you'll see a lot in commentaries. Not everything that was happening at the time is necessarily going to be helpful for understanding who's writing. Okay, so let me give you a great example. I have lots of friends who work in retail and in business in Northwest Arkansas. Some of them are very prominent leaders in Northwest Arkansas business. Imagine 2,000 years from now that somebody wants to try to understand, I don't actually know Doug, I've met Doug a couple times, but let's picture Doug McMillan at Walmart. They want to understand the heart of the Walmart CEO. So they go, we need to find some writings, some messages from prominent business leaders. You know, there is actually one business leader who was so prominent he became the president of the United States. So I bet he is representative of business people in America. So if we read Donald Trump's tweets, that will help us understand the priorities of Doug McMillan. Now, I'm not making any character assessments of either of those men. My guess is understanding the heart of Donald Trump probably would not give us great insights into the heart of Doug McMillan. I think they're pretty radically different men. And so that sometimes that kind of stuff happens in historical studies, is they just assume because someone at the time said something like this, that must have been how Paul was thinking. And you'll read some pretty strong stretches. And so one of the things we have to really work to do is understand, if we're reading Paul, what is Paul's background? What influences did Paul likely have? And we'll talk about this a lot when we get to reading Paul. What kinds of influences are actually going to be helpful for understanding Paul? And then we're also going to be interested in who was Paul's audience. And so when we're reading Ephesians, understanding what's going on in Ephesus at the time is going to be helpful. It might not tell us everything, but it's going to help us understand the kinds of things that are of concern to them as we read the cultural situation at the time. And so it's also going to help a lot when you get ready to teach people the Bible. So, everybody familiar with the Good Samaritan? Tell me about Samaritans and what kind of historical information would be helpful for understanding that story.
They are like historic, or like half Jewish, half another culture.
Yes, absolutely. So they've intermarried, and so they have some Jewish heritage, but some from all over. So they're mixed in their lineage. They also mixed their faith, and so when that happened, they compromised Torah and had a really blended, and they rejected the temple in Jerusalem. And so, how did Jews feel about them? I mean, so extremely so. We have a writing from, I think it's the 1st or 2nd century BC, where the author is describing how horrible 2 Gentile nations are, and then they said, and even beyond that is the non-people, the Samaritans. So,
The non-people?
yeah, they call them the non-people. Wow. Like they're not even a people. Because they were seen as corrupting Torah, they were actually viewed as worse than Gentiles by some of the Jews.
Wow.
They hated these people. Okay.
And
And they had a different version of Torah. So we actually have copies of the Samaritan Pentateuch today. Yeah, it's really interesting and you can compare the two together. And some of it is similar. The biggest way that they corrupted Torah was their application of it, because they rejected everything post-Torah in the Old Testament. There's some obvious reasons, because as soon as you get post-Torah, what starts to develop is Jerusalem as the center of worship and the Davidic king as the rightful king of Israel. Well, Samaritans reject all that because they don't believe the tribe of Judah should lead, and they don't believe the site of worship should be in Jerusalem. So they reject all of the prophets, everything post-Torah, and then they do actually have their own version of Torah that has been changed over the years. I've only read a little bit about Samaritan Pentateuch, but they had a separate text.
Do we know how Samaritans became like a people?
We do. We're going to talk about that today. Yeah, because it's an important part of kind of getting to our story here. So, when you're thinking about what this would have been like, it is a despised people. So that's going to really play in on that story. One of our leaders, a Levite, passes over. Then a priest passes over. then a Samaritan. Now, what was the original question? Do you remember the question that was asked to set up the story of the Good Samaritan?
Who's my neighbor?
Who is my neighbor? Why did the question, who is my neighbor, get asked? Love your neighbor. And what was the command to love your neighbor an answer to?
What must I do there?
Yeah. And so and Jesus says there are two commandments that summarize Torah. So the topic here is, in a sense, how do I keep Torah? And Jesus' answer is, this Samaritan kept Torah better than the Levites and the priests. I mean, he's going after him. And now, how are you going to teach this today? Now, I guarantee you, not everyone, most of the times I've heard this taught, people take a pretty soft application on who it is. But man, if I'm teaching this today, I am customizing this to the person I'm talking to the person I know they hate the most. So some of my deeply conservative friends who are freaking out about what's happening politically, my answer is a radical liberal Bernie supporter came along and actually obeyed God better than all the conservative evangelicals. Can you imagine how angry that would make some people? Or to my really left-leaning friends, a MAGA Trump guy, a white supremacist white nationalist came along. Can you imagine to people on the left if I said, a white supremacist is the embodiment of evil today? Now, was Jesus endorsing the Samaritans' view of religion? No, he was not saying they were right. He was trying to jab at them and say the person you hate the most, if they learn to love like I'm telling, could actually fulfill the law better. So pick the unforgivable sin in culture. Right now, the political right and left divide is so strong, you can have a lot of fun with that. So pick the person the left hates the most, pick the person the right hates the most, and have that person be your Samaritan. Historical background will really help you figure out how to apply this in your culture situation. So we want to be sensitive to that. Now, none of us in this room are historical background experts. My guess is. So this is where we're going to rely on the work that other people do. We're going to rely really heavily on commentaries and some other background resources to kind of help us learn this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the history. In your the Paul intro document that has the title Paul, the Apostle Misunderstood, we're going to talk a little bit about the world that's going on at this time. So let's back up even further than this a little bit. Let's do some panorama work here. Has everyone in here had panorama? Okay, cool. So we talk about panorama of the Bible. If you rewind a little bit in your mind, movement 8 is the exile. Tell me a little bit about why the exile happened.
Because of Israel's sin.
Yeah, what sin in particular?
Was it that they didn't give the land its Sabbath?
Yep, that's part of it. That's one big thing they did. That's something they're called out for, is not giving the land its Sabbath. That's part of what's going to happen. Is the land's going to get its Sabbaths. Mm-hmm.
Worshipping other gods.
Yeah, and idolatry is at the center of the whole problem that leads to exile. Now let's talk a little bit about where Samaritans come from. Two different exiles actually happen. When we talk about the exile, we're actually talking about two exiles, but by the time we get to the New Testament, only one really matters anymore. So Israel is divided into two peoples at this time. Israel in the north, Judah in the south, right? Because they split after Solomon. They have two different kings. Israel in the north gets conquered by Assyria. Now, Assyria's policy, every empire has to figure out, how do we keep people from rebelling? That's what you don't have time to have happen in an empire. An army is big enough to go conquer one nation at a time. None of these armies are big enough to police an entire empire constantly. So they have to come up with a policy for how do you keep people from rebelling. Assyria's policy was this. They figured rebellions happen when there's a sense of national identity. We are Israel, and we should not be ruled by Assyria. And so you usually appeal to your national god, to your national history, to kind of motivate people to rebel. So Assyria said, let's get rid of all national identity. So what they did was they displaced people from conquered and shuffled all of the empire around. And so they forced all these people to live in different places and to intermarry. And so what happened is they actually imported other peoples to the northern area of Israel and had them live there. And they intermarried with some of the Israelites that are still there. And that's where you get the Samaritan people. So what happened is they had a blend at the time of the religions that these other people brought in with Torah that they had at the time. So that's how you get the Samaritan people here. The words are rooted in the same thing. So Samaria was originally just a city in Israel. And then that becomes the capital city of the northern kingdom. So that is why these people get called Samaritans later. So when you're initially reading your Bible, in the Old Testament, the word Samaria just means the capital city in Israel, in the northern kingdom. By the New Testament, that word has become representative of these people. Now, what's also going to happen by New Testament times, and we'll get here, is this land gets carved up a little more. And you end up with Jews living up here in the region called Galilee. And the Samaritans are just confined to this middle region.
So were you a Samaritan because of your bloodline or because of your religious practice?
Though they were tied.
Okay.
They were tied to each other. So you probably would not have had any maybe this existed, but generally you would not have had non-Samaritan ethnic people practicing Samaritan faith.
Would you have people living in Samaria that wouldn't have been considered Samaritans because they were not of that bloodline?
Probably. There are people living across this region. Now, generally the Jews hated them, and so they avoided living here at all costs. But I don't know who all, because of the Greco-Roman world, we have much more people traveling abroad and that kind of stuff happening. So I don't know who all was living in Samaria. There probably were some non-Samaritans living there, but I don't know that for sure. That's a great question.
But you're still probably, I mean, of course you have people who are 100% Hebrew who are practicing Torah. So it's not like if your mom was Greek and your dad was Jewish,
right?
You're Samaritan. It's probably more so like culturally, like if you practice this, you're more Samaritan.
Let me see if I'm following your question. So the Samaritan people, this is about, when we're getting to the New Testament, we are 700 years after this exile. So one thing to remember is there's a certain level that some of that original lineage is probably lost. So by the time you get to the New Testament times, this is kind of all one big thing of the Samaritan people practicing the Samaritan faith.
I guess a better question is, did Jews like hate people who were like if you weren't 100% Jewish?
Yes. Hate might be too strong. They definitely look down on. There is a sense that we are, by the time you get to the New Testament, and we're going to see this developed, people are going to define, when you're trying to define the Jewish faith in the first century, one of the terms that's really popular that you'll see is the term, they use this term, Covenantal Gnomism, because when you get a PhD, you have to come up with fancy words to justify your education. Covenantal Gnomism means we are people of the covenant and we are people of the law. Gnome it comes from the root for law. Okay? So, there is a strong sense that we are the chosen people of God. And everyone else is not. Now, you're going to see a range in first century Judaism of how they approach Gentiles. I think hatred is an appropriate word. Like they see the Gentiles as evil. I'm not ready to say all Jews hated all Gentiles, but I don't think that's a stretch to understand from what I can see of the text of how they viewed Gentiles. And this is something we're going to talk about when we come to Paul, and particularly the doctrine of justification and a concept we're going to talk about called the new perspective on Paul. One of the discussions right now was when Paul is attacking the Jewish people's reliance on the law, what is he attacking? And the argument is, was the problem primarily the idea that you could earn your salvation by works, or was the problem the idea that salvation was for Jews only? That Torah was a boundary marker for the Jews and not for the Gentiles? Was Paul's primary interest when he talked about grace and not law? Was his primary interest teaching you that you can't earn your salvation, or was his primary interest teaching you that the gospel is for all peoples? That's the debate that's happening right now. I'll show my cards early. My answer is to say yes. Both principles are present in the discussion. But there's some valuable stuff that the discussion is helping us maybe clarify, I think. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But that question of the Jew-Gentile relationship is going to be central to this section of the New Testament we're going to study. So, is that helpful in understanding what happens here in Assyria and with the Samaritans? Now, the Jews get conquered by a different people called Babylon. Now, this is where I am just blown away at the sovereignty of God. Remember, what are we looking for in our Old Testament? What's the promise and the hope that we're looking forward to? A Messiah. And what do we know about Messiah from the Old Testament?
He's going to come and reestablish the kingdom.
He's going to reestablish the kingdom.
And forgive sins.
I'm sorry, forgive sins, yes. Anything else we know biographically? Tell me about Messiah. How do we recognize him? Tribe of Judah, line of David. Okay. Now God's going to punish the disobedience of people by exile. The Assyrian policy is to destroy all lineage. And God only has them conquer the northern kingdom, not the tribe of Judah. Babylon has a different policy for how to prevent a rebellion. Babylon's policy is this. They go, you know what? Leaders start rebellions. So we are actually going to take the elite from the people we conquer. We're going to bring them to Babylon, and we are going to try to make them Babylonian. We're not going to treat them like prisoners. We're going to put them in the palace. We're going to give them an Ivy League education. We're going to make them officials in our government. Okay? This is the story of Daniel, right? Now think about the sovereignty of God, that we need the Davidic line preserved. And so Judah gets conquered by an empire whose policy is to take your royal line, your royal family, your educated, your elite, and actually protect them rather than destroy them. So that the Davidic line gets preserved through Babylonian exile. Pretty incredible stuff. Now, what was those obnoxious Jews, the problem with them was they refused to become Babylonian. And that's one of the things the story of Daniel's about, is even in exile, when these young Jewish boys are taken to Babylon and treated like kings, they serve Babylon really well, but they stay loyal to Yahweh. They refuse to compromise in exile. And that's what's unique about the Jewish experience in exile. Mm-hmm.
So I was just listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago that talked about how Daniel and those boys grew up under King Josiah and that like new revival.
Yep.
Where like Josiah found the Torah again and just they were talking about how that must have played a role in like how does a kid know how to practice his faith at that level that Daniel and his friends did.
Yeah.
And they were just talking about Josiah and that revival that happened and how like again the sovereignty of God, like they're going into like they're about to be brainwashed, but
totally
because of that radical revival that Josiah kind of instituted, played a huge role. I thought that was really cool.
It really is cool. And the story of Daniel, I think, is so crucial for especially American Christianity today, because there's no doubt, like, culture is bending away from the Christian faith. And so there's going to be a couple of different responses. One is going to be panic and war. So let's go fight a culture war, try to win back America. I am much more interested in discipling our kids to be good Daniels, who are going to be able to be faithful to the Lord and be a witness to the Lord in a non-Christian culture. I think that is going to pay much higher dividends than going out and fighting a culture war. I don't know that we're going to win a culture war. We don't have the powerful engines of Hollywood that many people have. But what we are given is the power of discipleship. And so that's my passion right now, is to disciple people to be Daniels in this movement. So, interestingly, a couple of things are going to come out of this Babylon movement. First of all, it's where we actually get the word Jews. Okay, there are a few different terms you're going to see to describe these chosen people of God. The word Hebrew is the word for their language, and probably something closest to what we might call an ethnic term. It seems like that's what they were called earliest. There's some discussion about where this word Hebrew comes from, but it's very ancient. Okay, the word Israel is their national identity as the descendants of Jacob. But the word Jew or Jewish becomes identified because the leading tribe that comes back from the Babylon exile is from Judah. So Judaism is what develops out of the exile from the tribe of Judah that went into exile and came back. Okay, so when they go into exile in Babylon, 3 tribes go with them. Judah, Benjamin, who is tucked up under Judah, and then the Levites were scattered throughout the whole nation. That was God's design, that they would be embedded in every tribe to teach the tribes about the law. So if you think about our New Testament, think about what tribes you actually see mentioned in the New Testament. What tribe is Jesus from? Judah. Do you remember who Matthew is? We get Matthew's tribal name.
Levi.
Matthew's a Levite. Does anybody remember what tribe Paul's from?
Benjamin.
He's Benjamin. Those are the 3 tribes. You will not see any of the other 9 tribes mentioned in the New Testament. These are the 3 that survived Babylonian exile. So that's what you have left when you come to the New Testament period. Now that's a pretty devastating, that's a big question. What do we do with the idea that the 12 tribes are going to be restored? That's a big problem in the first century. Okay? Now, some other, go ahead.
Also, the northern group came back. They never come back. They were never actually away, so they were just always there.
Yeah.
And they just were intermixed.
They were intermixed so much that any tribal heritage was lost. There's no way to trace anymore. They didn't disappear. They're so intermixed now that no one can say I'm from the tribe of Dan. They were so scattered by the Assyrian Empire. Many of them probably didn't come back. Many of them probably got moved to other territories, and so there weren't great records kept. Any records were destroyed at this time. So the people who end up here in Samaria, there's really no way to say. Or do they have any Jewish lineage or any Israelite lineage? Are they just people from somewhere else in Samaria that the Assyrians imported?
So, but above that line, the northern, you couldn't say those people are Hebrew.
So these actually would be. So what ends up happening, and this is what develops in the history here, is people from Judah end up resettling up here. So you will have people with the Samaritans get crunched into this area. So you do end up with Jewish people living in Galilee. So yes, you'll have people like Joseph, who knows he's of the tribe of Judah, living up in Galilee. Yep. So initially you have this, but by the first century they get crunched down. Just like it's still happening in the Middle East today, where we just move peoples around and we carve up territories and say, this group, y'all live here now. Something similar happened. Samaritans just got crunched down. So a couple of things that are going to develop during Babylonian exile. One of the key questions, and this is really going to influence how we understand our New Testament, one of the key questions is going to be, how do I be faithful to God when the temple's gone? Okay, the temple, coming and experiencing sacrifice in the temple, that was really how you experience, that's the primary way you expressed your faith in Yahweh. The temple's gone now. So how do I express my faith in Yahweh with no temple, not in the land? So a few key markers are going to develop in this time. The first, and this is hard to trace historically, but what we know is there's no mention of a synagogue pre-exile. Post-exile, we have synagogues. So many people think that what happened was the idea of having teaching centers scattered throughout wherever there are Jews probably developed during the Babylonian exile. That they said, we need a mechanism of teaching Torah, of praying the Psalms, Since we don't have a temple, we'll have synagogues as teaching centers. So the synagogue tradition probably developed during the exile. So what else? If you're trying to be a good Daniel, if you're in exile in a foreign place and you want to show your faith to Yahweh, you can't go to Jerusalem and worship in the temple, but you want to show Yahweh and you want to show your neighbors that I'm loyal to Yahweh. How are you going to practice that? What options do you have? Keep Torah. Yeah, and how specifically? What are going to be the ways you're going to show that? Because some of Torah, like a lot of Leviticus is all about sacrifice, so a lot of Leviticus you can't keep. What can you keep?
Don't sin.
Don't sin.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
10 commandments.
10 Commandments are going to become really big. Sabbath keeping becomes huge. Sabbath keeping is a ritual act of purity that you can keep even without a temple. The food laws are going to become huge. Eating according to the food laws are another form of Levitical purity, of holiness. Remember, Leviticus taught us about distinguishing between the holy and the common. So how do you keep your holiness when there's no sacrifice? Well, you can keep the food laws even if you can't make sacrifices. Circumcision becomes key. That marker of your Jewishness, of your faithfulness to Yahweh. So, and the festivals are going to become key. So these boundary markers of Judaism become an expression of faithfulness to Yahweh. Now, when they come back to the land, those markers are going to stay really important. Because guess what? Pagan outside influence doesn't disappear when they come back to the land. So showing your Jewishness in the face of Persian, Greek, Roman influence is going to stay important. The problem is going to shift by the time we get to the first century. And I'm going a little bit into gospel stuff, which we've already addressed, but the problem pre-exile is idolatry. How many times do you see Jesus confronting idolatry in the Gospels? How many times do you see him pointing out to the Pharisees, hey, you have little wooden idols in your homes? Never. Like, that's what the prophets in the Old Testament are confronting Israel about all the time. It's gone after the exile. You do not have idolatry practiced in Israel post. And by the way, the archaeology backs that up. In our archaeological digs, when you dig in homes in Israel pre-exile, you find idols in a lot of the homes. When you dig in homes post-exile, you don't. The exile ended idolatry. What does Jesus primarily seem to be confronting?
The way that they follow Torah.
Good, the way, and specifically, what's wrong with the way they're following Torah? Yes, they became those marks, those distinguishing marks to show their faithfulness to Yahweh in exile. They seem to have become more attached to those distinguishing markers than to Yahweh himself, than to loving God and loving others. Was there anything wrong with those distinguishing marks? No, they were the right expressions of loyalty. But those expressions of loyalty became almost territorial, an us and them marker, more than a loyalty to Yahweh. It became more about distinguishing the us and the them than they did distinguishing between loyalty to Yahweh and loyalty to someone else. Now, we're finally actually up to the document there. I wanted to do a little background history there. That brings us forward. Now, you're going to have the Persian Empire is going to take over Babylon. And the Persian Empire has a different policy. Think again about the sovereignty of God here. God said 70-year exile. Persia's policy was people won't rebel if they're happy. So let's send people back home. Let them build their temples. Let them have their local laws. That's fine, as long as they pay their taxes. So think about the sovereignty of God, that God had Persia conquer Babylon right at the time it was time for the Jews to go home. That the empire with the policy of send the exiles home is the one that took over. And then you have a man named Alexander the Great who conquers the entire world. Now, for those of you who can remember your world history class, tell us about Alexander the Great and what he accomplished.
Everything. Before he was 30.
He did everything before he was 30. What was the result of Alexander the Great's conquest?
Every thing that he conquered, he took Greek culture to everything.
Do you remember who Alexander the Great's teacher was?
It was one of those guys.
One of those guys, Aristotle.
Aristotle, okay.
Yeah, so Alexander was tutored by Aristotle.
Right.
So he loved Greek culture and Greek philosophy.
Mhm.
So he, man, as I started to say the sentence, I felt a little chill of danger of contemporary politics. He felt like it was his responsibility to spread Greek culture everywhere he went. And so he was gifting the conquered peoples with Greek culture, Greek language, Greek learning. Now, when you think about Israel, when they come back from Persia, they rebuild the wall, they rebuild the temple, but something significant happens. There is never an enthroned Davidic king. That's part of the promise, right? They're supposed to have a Davidic king. So in many ways, the exile ends after 70 years, but they never get their king and they never get their kingdom. Another thing that never happens, this idea of the Shekinah glory of God. When they meet God on Sinai, they see his glory. When they dedicate the tabernacle, his glory fills the tabernacle. When Solomon dedicates the temple, bless you, his glory fills the temple. What happens when they dedicate the new temple? Nothing. So there is a very profound sense that something is not right in Israel.
Is that in the Bible when they dedicate the second temple and God doesn't come?
They don't draw attention to it. They don't go, and the glory didn't come. They just don't record it happening. And they tell us that the older people wept. The younger people are all going, yay, the temple's built. And the older people start weeping. And
Do you happen to know off the top of your head where that passage would be?
it's,
Sorry.
no, you're fine. Not off the top of my head. It's going to be in, I think it's going to be in Ezra. That's a great question.
You can
It's
tell
like-
us later if you want.
Okay. It's going to be Ezra or Nehemiah. I'm not sure.
Like, what do you do at that point? If you're an Israelite and you're like, we just built and dedicated the temple, but God's glory isn't here, so like, what's the point?
That is the entire question of first century Judaism. What went wrong? This is crucial to understanding the situation on the ground in the first century. The whole Pharisee, Sadducee, Essene debate, the question they are wrestling with is this. We have clearly missed something. We are still waiting. Those promises of Ezekiel, that God would restore the dry bones and bring life, that he would renew us by his Spirit, those haven't happened yet. So the sense in the first century is we came back from exile, but God didn't come with us. So when is God going to visit us? And here's the really important question. We're told that there's a remnant of faithful Israelites. What kind of faithfulness is God looking for when he comes? So the real question that they're asking is, each of them have a different answer. The Sadducees are the ones who rule the temple, and they're the pragmatists. Their answer is, let's play nice with Rome. We're going to be a little bit politically savvy about this. We're going to play nice with Rome, and we're the ones in charge. We're in charge of the temple. God's going to honor the leaders. That's what God does. He honors the leaders. So the Sadducees are the elites. The Pharisees have a different strategy. They say, our problem is lack of holiness. So this was the Pharisees' basic theology. If priests and the tabernacle are supposed to be holy, wouldn't it be good if everyone was that holy? So they said, let's take the tabernacle rules and make it apply to your home. All of them. So they actually extended the holiness code beyond just the Levites. So in Leviticus, you have a level of holiness for the Levites and then a level of cleanliness for all the people. They said, let's just make all the people live by Levitical code.
Who's that one?
That's the Pharisees. So they're all imagining God is going to come. This is how it plays out in their mind. God's Messiah is going to come, and he's going to go, you guys, you're the ones who got it right. Come rule in my kingdom. Remember what the disciples were interested in? Who's going to sit at your right hand in your kingdom? That's part of the question. When the kingdom comes, which of these groups is Yahweh going to say, you got it right? Now, the Essenes, have we talked much about the Essenes? The Essenes are a group that their theology was this: the temple is corrupt, God's not there, let's condemn the whole thing. They moved into the wilderness, they moved into the Dead Sea area, and they preached prophetically against the temple. They said that temple is corrupt and dead, so they created a small community of people who said, we're going to move out into the desert, we're going to study the scriptures and wait for Messiah to come. So they believed Messiah would come, condemn the temple, and then look at their community and say, these are my people. And he would gather them. Now think about the imagery here when you think about the life of Jesus. That he would gather the Essenes and lead them on a march to Jerusalem where he reclaimed his throne. You have a fourth group, the Zealots, who thought God needs an army. And so they were going to say, hey, let's be an army of God and let's fight. That is the argument going on. Now, why was Jesus... There were a lot of bad teachers in Judaism, a lot of rabbis that were told they were wrong. They didn't get crucified. They didn't crucify Jesus because they didn't like his teaching. What did Jesus do that was so offensive to all of these groups? Yeah, he said, I'm the Son of God, and specifically he said, none of you are right. The ones that God is going to honor is everyone who attaches to me. He went throughout the countryside saying, the kingdom is coming. Rally to me. Not to the Pharisees, not to the Sadducees, not to the Essenes, not to the Zealots. Rally to me. When God assesses Israel and he says, who is in the right? The answer is not going to be the ones who kept the holiness code perfectly. The answer is not going to be the ones who went into the desert and condemned the temple. The answer is going to be everyone who placed their faith in his son.
Did the Essenes play a role in Jesus' arrest?
No. Because they're living out in the caves in Qumran, they may or may not have been aware. They lived as separatists.
So they didn't even go to Jerusalem for Passover?
I don't believe so. I believe they rejected. Yeah, they rejected the temple. So, and I don't know exactly how they practiced Passover. I don't know if they had their own Passover out at Qumran. I don't know how they did it. But they rejected the temple as being a false temple. Many people connect John the Baptist with the Essenes. I don't think he actually was an Essene, but his ministry sounds a lot like him. Go out in the wilderness and preach against the leadership in Jerusalem. So, why does all this matter? So think about this. All of this background is going to be really important for understanding Paul's passion. Paul was a Pharisee. Now, there's a tradition in the Jewish tradition around the concept of zeal. It begins with a man named Phineas. Do y'all remember Phineas from Numbers? Okay, so this is Phineas' story. Remember when Balaam tries to curse Israel and he can't? All of his attempts failed. Do you remember what he finally succeeds at doing? The king is trying to go, how are we going to stop these Israelites? You can't curse them. Do you remember his strategy? Cause them to marry foreign women who will bring idols into the camp. He said, we can't supernaturally curse them, but we can seduce them. So Balaam coaches him and says, send Moabite women in, and the Israelite men will marry them. They'll sleep with them, and they'll bring idols into the camp. And Phineas sees an Israelite, he sees an Israelite man bringing a Moabite woman into his tent and takes a spear and drives it through both of them, I think while they're in bed together. I think is the image. He goes into their tent and spears them. And God goes, you honored my holiness. The zeal of Phineas. That's where it's at. Okay?
That makes me really uncomfortable.
It's super uncomfortable. Okay. The next example is Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You remember what happens there? The whole country's going after Baal, similar to the Moabite experience. The whole country's going after Baal, and Elijah seems like the only prophet left. The only person left who's pointing people to Yahweh. So remember, he goes up on a mountain, and he says, okay, let's build 2 altars, and let's see if one of our gods will can send down fire. and they dump water on his, and he's mocking Baal. Hey, maybe he has to go to the bathroom, you know. Maybe he's sleeping. Why don't you check and see? And then nothing happens. They call down fire, and then you know what he does? He slays all the prophets of Baal. That's zeal for Yahweh. Okay.
How does he do that?
I don't remember if he gets help. I can't, or if he. I think he might. I think he might call on some Jews. I think he has a.
They kill themselves.
No, they were slashing themselves. That was one ritual practice, was to actually cut yourself to draw blood to show your loyalty. But no, he killed him. So oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, if he was able to, like, God was able to supernaturally bring down fire, then I don't think it'd be an issue for him to.
Yeah, I don't remember how if he rallies a group of of Israel to help him, or how they slay them all. But they kill all the prophets of Baal. Okay, this is zeal for Yahweh. The next big example comes when the Greeks rule Israel. Do we mention this here? These are Garland's notes. So I'm trying to figure out what he puts on here and what he doesn't. Okay. Yeah, it's the Maccabean revolt. So what happens is, after Alexander dies, the Greek Empire split into 4 regions. Okay, you have a Greek part, a part led by Turkey, a part led by Syria, and a part led by Egypt. Okay, so, but you still have the remnants of the Greek Empire ruling over Israel. And what happens is they come through and they start making people sacrifice to the Greek gods. And one Jewish priest stands up and says no. And he kills the soldier who's making them do it. And they lead a revolt. And we get this phrase, the abomination of desolation, that comes from Daniel. Antiochus Epiphanes, who is one of the Greek rulers at the time, he goes into the temple and sacrifices a pig on the altar. An unclean animal sacrificed in the altar of God. And this brings such a rage among this group of family, the Maccabeans, they're called Maccabeans, word for hammer, the Hasmoneans, that they lead a revolt to drive the Greeks out of the temple. And part of the whole idea of the menorah, they go inside the temple and they're able to drive the Greeks out, and they're basically hunkered down. It's almost like an Alamo type situation, as I understand it. And they have to do this temple rededication ceremony because it's been defiled, and they only have enough oil to light. They're supposed to light the lamps for a whole week. They only have enough oil for one day, and miraculously, the oil lasts for the entire cleansing ceremony. And that is Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the celebration of the Jews rededicating the temple after it was defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes.
So, question about the miraculous oil. If they're trying to cleanse it, but God was never there, and he doesn't come back afterwards, what's the point?
I wouldn't say that God was not with Israel. I think God's sovereign hand is still guiding Israel in this season. What you don't get is that visible Shekinah glory of God, the indwelling of the temple. But they are still trying to get there. So in rededicating the temple, I think they're hoping we can get to this place where God returns. If we're faithful and we do our work. So this is the hope of all of this, is we're trying to get God to return to Israel in a visible, powerful way and restore the hearts of the people. So this Maccabean revolt becomes the new standard of loyalty. Raise up arms against the oppressor, the Gentile oppressor that's invaded our land. So now, if you think about what does it look like to be zealous for God? Phineas, Elijah, the Maccabeans. And then along comes a young, passionate hotshot named Paul. Now, Paul was probably born sometime around in between 5 and 10 AD. So, think about your picture of Paul, like all of our pictures of Paul we have, right? He looks kind of like a Renaissance Moses, right? Santa Claus kind of figure.
So
Okay, if he's born, let's just for a working number, we don't know for sure, but if he's born around 10 AD, what year was Jesus crucified?
33, 36.
Somewhere in there. Let's go with 33 for a working number. How old was Paul at the crucifixion of Jesus?
20?
Yeah, 23. 28 at the oldest. So it seems like it's within a year or so, it's not too long after, that Stephen is martyred. And Paul is a leader there holding their cloaks. How old is Paul? He's in his 20s. He's a young gun. He's a passionate hothead who is trying to rise in the ranks of Judaism. He's really intelligent. He's trained under the best teacher. And he is trying to prove he has what it takes. And he has the zeal. He is trying to follow in the footsteps of Phineas, Elijah, and Judas, the hammer, Maccabeus, and passionately fight for God. So he sees this early church as the Jewish man and the Moabite woman, the prophets of Baal that need to be slayed to honor our faithfulness to Yahweh. That's the driving force of young Paul. He's trying to live out that zeal. Now, by the time we get to Jesus, we have the Roman world has now taken over. And part of Rome was they built, you get the Roman roads. So one of the things is they want to create an empire where trade and economy flourishes. And so they build security with a military that polices the empire. They build a great road system that allows travel to be free and safe. Free, you can get taxed, but you can still travel well. And then you have this person named Caesar Augustus. Now, a lot of y'all probably remember a little bit about your Roman history, right? Who is Caesar Augustus? Y'all remember this from old world history classes?
Caesar.
He's the ruler of Rome. Do you remember who he follows? He's the first Caesar after Julius Caesar. Okay, so Julius Caesar is the first emperor to like turn Rome to having an emperor, right? And he is assassinated, and then a fight breaks out between two would-be successors. You remember who they are? Octavian and Antony, right? And there's the whole thing with Cleopatra, all that weird stuff that goes on. Octavius wins the day, and Octavius declares himself Caesar Augustus. Augustus means great. So he declares himself the great Caesar. So when we get to Luke chapter 2, and we read that it was in the days of Caesar Augustus, that's the emperor we're talking about. Okay? He is the one. Julius Caesar may have conquered the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is the one who made it great. He's the one who really becomes the glorious. Julius Caesar doesn't live long enough to even enjoy being Caesar because he gets betrayed. Augustus is the first emperor of Rome to really rule Rome. And he gets declared Pontifex Maximus, which means is Latin for the greatest priest. It's the term that will later be applied to the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. So, Greco-Roman culture spreads throughout the world. The pantheon of gods gets mixed in and everything. And they rule over everything. So, just a few like little stats about life in Rome. Just to give you a sense, the Roman Empire is about 70 to 100 million people. There's about 1 to 8 million Jews. Now, think about those numbers there. That's actually a pretty substantial number of Jews in the empire. They equate to somewhere up to 8% of the Roman Empire. So that's a substantial portion of the Roman Empire's Jewish people. Rome had 1 million people in it. That's a staggering population size for this time period. London, we do not see the whole movement with mega big cities. That has happened in the last 100 years. Like there has been a huge influx to cities in the last 100 years. We don't have, after the Roman Empire falls apart, we don't have big cities again until Europe after the Renaissance. And so London doesn't get back to 1 million people till the 1800s. This is a massive city. Antioch, 500,000. Tarsus, which is where Paul's from, 100,000. Jerusalem has 75,000, which is still a substantial city, and it would triple in size during feast season.
That's terrifying.
It is terrifying. And think about this. Now, this is one of the reasons that Pontius Pilate is so freaked out. Remember, what's the job of an empire? Don't let the people rebel. You want to get rich off their taxes. Now, there is this Maccabean tradition in Israel of the passionate Jews who rise up, specifically associated to their sacrifices, and fight off the empire. And Pontius Pilate's aware of this, and at Passover time, when did Passover begin? In Egypt, when the Exodus, when God delivered his people from the great empire. So it would be like, if you can picture, imagine the United States is conquered by some foreign country, but we're still allowed to kind of practice our old things. Now imagine that millions of people flock to DC every year to celebrate the 4th of July.
It'd be so funny.
It'd be so funny. Celebrating the 4th of July under foreign rule. Now, if you're worried about a rebellion in America, when is the time that you're going to be most concerned of something happening? At that 4th of July celebration when everybody goes to DC, right? And so that's what's on their minds at these Passover celebrations. Is they are scared that there's going to be a new Maccabean revolt. So when all the people start rioting, Pilate was a ruthless ruler. He is not sympathetic to the Jews. Why is he worried about pacifying Jewish leaders when they start rioting? Not because he's some sensitive leader. He wants to stop a rebellion. And so in his mind, if crucifying an innocent man stops a rebellion and keeps him in power, that's great, whatever. Sure, let's crucify Jesus. I don't think he did anything wrong, but I can't have a riot on my hands at Passover. That is not going to go well for me.
It was really interesting and I really just noticed this in our last class, the Gospels class, is Pilate's wife's dream.
Yeah.
And just that just kind of made me pause and think that's so random.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
And he didn't really pay any attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like why? Like that was just weird.
It's weird.
Like,
No doubt about it. Now, to give you a sense of where Jesus is from, Jerusalem, 75,000. Capernaum, anywhere from 6 to 10,000. How many people lived in Nazareth? About 500 people. We would call this a podunk town.
Oh.
We have some dear friends from Australia, and I used the word podunk in conversation with them today, and they stopped saying, what's a podunk? So I had to define podunk for them. Nazareth is tiny. It is nowhere. It is not on the map. Languages are important at this time. So you had the Hebrew language. I'm going to work backwards going up this chart here, this list here. That was the language of Torah. However, in Babylonian exile, they spoke Aramaic. So during the exile, Aramaic becomes the street language of the Jewish people. So similar to in the Muslim world a lot today, if you're a strictly observant Muslim, what language do you have to teach the Quran in? Arabic. Arabic is the language of Quran, right? My understanding is for some it's a violation to translate it. Is that true? So something similar would have been in place. Now they didn't feel quite that strong, but Hebrew was the language of Torah. So the people who really knew Hebrew were a lot of times going to be your rabbis and your people like that. So if you're a Jewish kid growing up in the first century, you're probably going to speak Aramaic in the home, and you're going to go to Torah class. And in Torah class, you're going to learn Hebrew. Now, Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar, so it wouldn't have been a huge leap. This is probably a stretch, but if you know like Latin or Italian and Spanish, a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap. That's similar to what's happening with Aramaic and Hebrew. And so they would have gone to Torah class where they would have learned Hebrew, specifically the young boys. So Aramaic is the street language. Hebrew is the Torah language. Greek has become the economic language of the empire. So probably, if you are a slave or a servant working a field, you might not need to know Greek. But if you're a fisherman who's selling fish in the marketplace, guess what you learn? You learn Greek. There's 500 people in Nazareth. Do you think that a carpenter made his living by building stuff for those 500 people? There is a large Greek city near Nazareth. Most people think that they were probably tradesmen who sold their stuff at that Greek city. So Jesus probably learned Greek. He probably had to go into the city. And we say carpenter. The word actually just means a craftsman. It could be a stonemason. It could be a woodworker. And there's a big stone quarry in that city. So some people think what Jesus actually did was he was a stonemason who built stuff for that nearby Greek city. We don't know for sure. He was some kinds of hands-on craftsman.
What do you think he would have learned in Egypt?
That's great. I don't know what they spoke in Egypt. I don't know. I think they probably had some Greek in Egypt, but I bet they probably also had Egyptian. That's a great question. I don't know how much.
According to the chosen,
Yes.
spoke a little bit of Egyptian.
Did he? Okay, well that would make sense. That would make sense if he spoke some Egyptian.
I wonder how accurate that is.
So it's a really funny thing that you'll see in scholarship, and this gets really important when we get to our New Testament letters. Paul's not a problem because Paul grew up in Tarsus, which is a Greek city. It's a Roman city, so he would have learned Greek there. But when you talk about the letters of John and Peter, skeptical scholars will tell you these dumb Jewish fishermen couldn't have written in Greek. And this is where the bias in scholarship is so strong it kills me. There's actually one scholar, a guy named Bart Ehrman at North Carolina Chapel Hill, who's a big-time skeptic. And this is the kind of stuff he slides in. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there was a study where somebody surveyed all of like the business receipts and everything they could written from in Israel in the first century. And they concluded something like between, I don't remember the numbers, it was something like between 5 and 25% of Jews would have written Greek in the first century. He published in his book, no more than 5% of Jews spoke Greek, and he cited her study. Notice that little sleight of hand that happens there? When the study said somewhere between 5 and 25%, and he picks the bottom end in his book that he writes for college students on why you can't trust the New Testament, and says 5%. And here's the other mistaken thought. What kind of people were the disciples? Were they poor, middle class, or rich? We've always said that, haven't we?
Yeah.
Take a look at the class system at the bottom of the page there. This is Roman, but I think there's going to be some interesting here. The aristocracy, the rich, makes up 10%. The plebeians, the free-born middle class, makes up 10%. The poor make up 10%, and 70% are slaves. What kind of work, if you think about the parables of Jesus, what kind of work are the poor doing? They're the day workers in the field. Remember all the stories Jesus tells where somebody's just working for a single day's wage in a field? Were the disciples field workers working for a day's wage? What kind of vocations did the disciples have? Fishermen. Fishermen whose parents owned their own business and owned their own boats. What else? Tax collectors. Guys, the disciples were not the bottom of the totem pole. They also weren't rich. They were the middle class. They were people who were trained in professions and trades. And probably, if anyone read and wrote Greek, it's probably these fishermen. Now, second level here, they then spent the next 40 years of their life traveling the Greek world. Do you think they could have picked up some Greek in those 40 years? Definitely. So it is not at all unlikely that a marginally educated Jewish kid would have known Aramaic, enough Hebrew to get by reading Torah, and some functional Greek in the marketplace. So, hey, just a little bit more about kind of what's going on in the world around. Take a look at the page that has the word social ethics on it. When we go outside of Israel, and this is one of the things that distinguished Israel from the larger Roman world. In Israel, the social ethic looks very much like we would expect in kind of a generally evangelical Christian culture today, right? You were expected to have monogamous marriage. You were expected to hold sex back until marriage. They took care of children. Many of the kind of what we would call conservative family values in America today, that was Jewish culture. And it was considered really weird to the rest of the Roman world. When you leave Israel and go into any Roman city, the brothel is like a central downtown place. Like prostitution is everywhere. homosexual sex acts, widely accepted. Like, it was understood that if you were a man who was leading in town, essentially anyone who wasn't someone else's wife was available for you, including young boys. That was really common behavior in the Roman world. Divorce was common. Infanticide and abortion was common. You would abandon children. And then you had these philosophers who would consider ethics and morality. But one of the things that's really interesting that's going on, first, a couple of distinctions in the way we tend to think of them. We think of religion. We tend to think of a compartment of our life that has to do with faith. So we'll have a compartment like religion and politics and work and family, and these are different compartments. No one thought that way in the first century. They saw spirituality as undergirding everything. Faith, spirit, let me use the term spirituality. Spirituality was intermixed with politics. Every political move was seen as having the gods behind it in some way. Business, family, spirituality intermixed with everything. The general street person in the Greco-Roman world was not thinking about ethical matters at all. That's what philosophers do. The general street person in Rome, their basic idea was go live your life, seek after what you want, and make sacrifices to the gods so they'll bless you. And they trusted the philosophers and the priests to figure stuff out. That's why it's really interesting. If you read what the first century Romans said about Christians, one of the assessments, I can't remember who said it, he said it's really weird. They're trying to turn all their people into philosophers. Now, why did they say that? Because here was a faith, every other spirituality, the priests did all the thinking about God, and the people just showed up, paid their tax, and made their sacrifice. But here are the Christians saying, no, we want all the people to learn our texts. We want all the people to learn what the scriptures say, and we want you to think about right living with God too. They were turning the people into priests and philosophers who understood their faith. And that was really weird for the Greco-Roman world, that the common person was supposed to learn the thinking behind the faith. That was a bizarre shift. And now think about this in light of today's cultural situation. Their ethics of sexuality and of how to treat children was radically weird for a Roman world. Radically weird for a Roman world. Have any of you been to Italy? Okay. If you go into a Roman site, like, it is pornographic. Like, it is shocking. Like, they will have explicit paintings of what kind of acts you can go in and pay for at the brothel. Like, the statues are shockingly pornographic. I mean, it is like you are walking into just this hyper-sexualized culture everywhere. And that's Ephesus. That's Corinth. That is Rome. That's the context that Paul is writing, saying we are going to live differently. You're going to be surrounded by it. And in 1 Corinthians, he's going to talk about expelling the immoral believer who's acting out. He said, by the way, I'm not talking about the world. It's not our job to police their behavior. I'm talking about what the life of the faith in the church is going to look like. So this is a little bit of the world that we're going to be speaking into as the church is beginning to grow. Now, what we're going to do on Thursday is we're going to crack open the book of Acts. And we're going to begin to survey the book of Acts and look at what's happening. But here's the key question that I want to leave us with as we shift toward the book of Acts. One of the points we made a lot in the Gospels class was we were trying to really emphasize the Jewishness of Jesus' ministry. And we emphasized over and over again that Jesus was bringing a Jewish message to a Jewish people. And we even cautioned pretty regularly, be careful of trying to take Jesus' ministry practice from the Gospels and assuming that that should immediately apply to our ministry practices today. That the way Jesus sent people out to preach to Jewish cities is how we should seek people out to be missionaries in other cities today. Do y'all remember this caution just a little bit that we threw out there? So the question we need to ask is, if Jesus came as a Jewish Messiah and what he did was like an asteroid hitting the ocean, like it just blew everything up. So the question is, now that you've had the Jesus moment, the Messiah moment, what are the implications of that for ministry? How should the church then apply the teachings of Jesus outside a Jewish context? The book of Acts and the letters of Paul give us that answer. That's why I am personally hyper-resistant to the red letter movement. to the idea that somehow the red letters of Jesus are more central than the rest of the New Testament. Jesus did not write anything in the New Testament. All we have in the New Testament are the followers of Jesus relaying what they learned from him. The Gospels through narrative, the epistles through letters. I think we need the whole of the New Testament to guide us in how to apply what Jesus did to us today. So the book of Acts and is really going to try to work that out. We'll talk about the book of Acts later. To finish out our interpretive grid here, literary, we want to understand the type of literature we're looking at. Okay, so we've talked a lot about narrative. We've almost done only narrative so far in our studies. We're going to turn our hand to looking at letters when we start to get Paul's. And then theological. Theological is being sensitive to what God has revealed up to this point. Sensitive to the movements of what God is doing. And sensitive to how all of it fits together. So we want to go back and forth between diving really deep down into a paragraph and then pulling back and saying, what is God doing here? How does all this fit together? And so we want to do that dance back and forth. So, any questions before Thursday? Or anything to cover from today that we've talked about?
Could you expand on what you mean by not just taking the words or teaching of Jesus, or coupling the words and teachings of Jesus with the rest of the New Testament?
Yep.
To apply to our context today? Can you just expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, are y'all familiar with kind of the red letter Christian movement? Have y'all seen this? So, one of the things that they're trying to do is, and they will say this very explicitly, they say the red letters of Jesus are, it's almost like the difference I just use American political examples all the time, the difference between the Constitution and laws that get passed. And we understand that the Constitution will always trump an individual law. If somebody can show, hey, this law doesn't quite measure up to the Constitution, that's what the Supreme Court does, is they can strike a law if they think it's unconstitutional. They almost treat the red letters like the Constitution and the rest of the New Testament underneath it. Mm-hmm. And so they will say, we need to let the red letters translate, sometimes even trump, and sometimes this movement sometimes, in my opinion, becomes a little anti-Paul. And they kind of see Jesus' words, the red letters, as the founding charter of the church. And then everything else as secondary. And
Therefore,
I think
it doesn't have as much authority.
Therefore, it doesn't have as much authority. And here's the big mistake in that. When Jesus is preaching, he is preaching, and what typically happens is this. A lot of, as they move, when they do that, what typically comes out of is a high emphasis on social justice, all things I believe in, help for the poor and that kind of stuff, because those are the things Jesus is harping on. And they usually de-emphasize some of the other ethical issues, even the evangelism call tends to get de-emphasized. And I think that is completely unsympathetic to the historical moment of Jesus. Who is Jesus preaching to? Yeah, he's preaching to Jews who have Torah, who have the entire heritage. They don't need to be, do the Jews need to be corrected on their sexual practices? No, they were a very sexually pure people. They practiced really pure marriage practices. So Jesus didn't need to rail on that. That wasn't their issue. They were neglecting love and compassion for their neighbor.
Yeah, Jesus didn't come preaching to the world.
He didn't come preaching to the world. So what I'm trying to make the point of here is Jesus is really good for his actual sermons, obviously are really good. They are speaking to a very particular context of the Jewish people. Right. Jesus is preaching to religious people who are missing God. Mm-hmm. Paul is preaching to people who don't know God. And I think we need the whole of it. I think what sometimes the red letter movement does is it actually plucks, in an attempt to honor Jesus, they pluck Jesus out of his context. And I think we need the context of the whole Bible to even understand Jesus.
Right, yeah.
So that's what I'm emphasizing is let's be holistic in our thinking rather than treating kind of a canon within a canon where the red letters are somehow elevated above everything else. I don't think that's an appropriate move.
I think that what I've heard is, we are disciples of Jesus. Primarily. So you should disciple of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so we're not disciples of Paul. But then Paul says, everything I've done, I've imitated through what I've learned from Jesus.
Yes.
So So it's a hard thing because, like, honestly, we're disciples under you right now. Right?
You're always learning from the people in front of you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I mean, the other thing to think about that I think is fascinating, the Gospels were some of the last things written in our New Testament. So the church at Ephesus did not have the Gospels. What they had was the preaching of the message, and then the letters they were getting on how to live the Christian faith, and they had the Old Testament. So yeah, I think that whole we're disciples of Jesus, not disciples of Paul, I think that's just a misstep. I think that's a big misstep in how to understand. We were given a faith of what it means to be a Jesus follower, and I think that's the whole of the New Testament. And so I think we need to be holistic, and I don't think we can privilege one over the other. I think the goal is to try to be holistic in our thinking in a way that says they fit. Like the thing that Jesus did caused Paul's ministry to happen. Therefore, they should fit. And if we can't see how they fit, we haven't done our work. We have not studied it faithfully enough. And if we pit them against each other, I think that's a misstep. So, hey, let me pray and we'll get out of here. Lord, we love you. Thank you for your goodness and your grace. Thank you for how you love us. Thanks for this incredible opportunity to study your word. Guide us as we do so and help us to be more faithful to you. We love you and praise things in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, for next week, or for Thursday, bring this. This is going to be kind of our guide for working through the book of Acts. We'll work through the book of Acts, get started. We'll start Paul. We'll start Paul's letters. When do we do that in the schedule? I've lost my syllabus. So I think it's in 2 weeks. Yeah, we'll start Galatians in 2 weeks. So the opening section of this is background on the person of Paul. And so I would say be reading through that over the next 2 weeks so that when we then jump into Galatians, we'll read Galatians that week. So questions, thoughts, rebellions, or rebuttals?
So our classes are Tuesday, Thursday, 6:15 to 7:45.
Yes. Does that work for everybody that time?
Oh,
Perfect.
I'm excited for an extra 30 minutes.
I know, I am too. I'm excited to have the time.
A whole extra hour.
Whole extra hour.
I'll be here Tuesdays.
Yep.
And then I'll do
Live stream Thursday. That's awesome. That's great.
And I'll be here as much as possible, and then Summer will be. Will there be like? Is it just live stream?
No, the live stream will automatically upload after it's over.
Okay, because summer camp is. a whole
Yep,
different
yep, yeah, no, I totally get it. No, YouTube is going to really serve us well. So it'll live stream and it'll automatically create a playlist of our live streams in this class so you can go back and watch them.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You bet.
See ya.
See you guys.